This is not an aircraft carrier, and this is a helicopter. According to the Japanese, Izumo is a helicopter-carrying destroyer, not a carrier. Why else would Izumo be moving side by side with two other destroyers? Following that classification logic, I guess Yamato was also a patrol boat. Joking aside, while the Japanese Navy is one of the most powerful in the world, officially, Japan doesn't even have a navy. That's because they're not allowed to have a military altogether. Why? Well, in a nutshell, once upon a time, Japan attacked the United States, which in turn nuked them back, twice, and sunk most of the Imperial Japanese Navy by 1945, which led to their surrender. The victorious Americans then pronounced no more military for the Japanese folks. However, they did allow Japan to have a self-defense force, which was more of a police force, given that it wasn't allowed to operate on foreign soil. So today, the Japanese police force consists of three branches that together form the Japan Self-Defense Force, or JSDF. But why Japan is not allowed to have aircraft carriers, and how the Japanese tricked the system to get them built. Why the Izumo carriers are handicapped and currently remain useless. And what's the true purpose of this sphere is not what you think. Ever since the formation of the Japan Maritime Self-Defense Force, or JMSDF, they've always wanted to acquire aircraft carriers. But this was impossible due to the political turmoil over the Japanese constitution, which prohibited offensive weapons such as aircraft carriers. Specifically, the issue lies within Article 9 of the Japanese Constitution, which was drafted by Americans. Article 9 renounces the right of war and prohibits Japan from maintaining land, sea, and air forces. Back in the 1980s, Japanese politicians said absolutely no to the aircraft carriers, but as a compromise agreed that the JMSDF could acquire helicopter carriers. Of course, that wasn't enough, and the JMSDF kept pressuring the government to supplement their helicopter carriers with Harrier jets. However, this never happened due to the political considerations and opposition from the US Navy. As a result, instead of getting Harriers, the JMSDF decided to acquire Aegis destroyers. But the goal of having aircraft carriers never died. Knowing that it would be impossible to sell an aircraft carrier to the politicians, in the 2000s, the JMSDF designed the Izumo-class as a carrier, but sold it as a helicopter-carrying destroyer to the politicians, who swallowed the bait. The fact that the Izumo-class was designed with the possibility of operating fixed-wing aircraft from early on was kept a secret, because everyone knew that having aircraft carriers broke the Article 9 of the Constitution. The goal of the JMSDF was to wait for the right moment to pressure the Japanese politicians to allow the conversion of the Izumo to an aircraft carrier. Of course, from the start, critics saw the Izumo-class for what it really was, calling the ship attack aircraft carriers. Not surprisingly, the loudest critic was the communist China, calling it an aircraft carrier in disguise. To be clear, Japan wasn't trying to fool other countries. I mean, this is clearly not a destroyer. They were just finding ways to trick their own government into letting them build certain types of ships. We'll get into the details of this in a little bit. The Izumo-class helicopter-carrying destroyers are currently the largest ships in the JMSDF, with their primary mission being anti-submarine warfare. This is why each ship of the class is equipped with 7 anti-submarine warfare helicopters and 2 search and rescue helicopters. But as we alluded earlier, the Izumo-class wasn't really built to chase submarines. That was all a cover-up. And this really shows because the ships lack the defensive weapon systems that are present on the preceding Hyuga-class ships. Hyuga-class helicopter destroyers are the true submarine hunters, since the two ships in the class have 16 Mark 41 VLS cells, which can launch both anti-air and anti-submarine missiles. Additionally, the Hyuga-class ships are equipped with 2 torpedo tubes. Since the Izumo-class was always meant to be an aircraft carrier, those weapon systems were never installed on it. The objective of the class was to carry up to 28 aircraft, while the escort ships in the carrier strike group would take care of launching torpedoes and missiles. Furthermore, the Izumo-class has a minimum amount of self-defense weapons, such as 2 Phalanx Seawiz and 2 Sea-Rams. The position of one Phalanx Seawiz is questionable to say the least. The ship has a 25-bed hospital, and the hangar is 3 stories high or 24 feet tall, with the ability to store up to 14 SH-60K helicopters. Usually, all aircraft are stored inside hangars to protect them from the salty sea breeze spray, which is extremely corrosive. The upper deck is a full-length flight deck, measuring 803 feet in length and 124 feet in width, which is slightly smaller than the flight deck on the Wasp-class amphibious assault ships, which is 840 feet in length and 140 feet in width. Unlike American supercarriers or the French Charles de Gaulle aircraft carrier, the Izumo-class is not nuclear-powered, but is instead conventionally powered by 4 gas turbines that provide enough power to achieve a speed of 30 knots. The first ship in the class was commissioned on March 25, 2015, and the second carrier was commissioned 2 years after. The name of the second Izumo-class carrier was originally debated to be Nagato, but that idea was shot down by politicians early on, in order to not stir things up overseas. That's because the Nagato battleship killed lots of Americans in World War II. So instead, they named her Kaga, as a reference to a Japanese province. But Kaga was also an aircraft carrier built for the Imperial Japanese Navy during World War II. It's not hard to imagine that one day in the future, the USS Enterprise, which is currently under construction, would end up scheduled to sail along JS Kaga together, and they'll probably meet up at Midway, you know? As an aircraft carrier, the Izumo-class is currently useless. That's because Japan doesn't own any aircraft capable of short takeoff and vertical landing. Back in 2019, Japan ordered 42 patrol planes. Yes, 42 F-35Bs. However, it'll be a while before they receive them. In fact, the batch of the first 6 was supposed to be delivered in March 2025. But then, whose fighter jets are these, operating from Japanese flat tops? Since it won't be until 2030 or so before Japan receives all fighter jets and achieve initial operational capability, the JMSDF has not ruled out the use of their carriers by their allies in the event of an emergency. So for the first time in 75 years, fighter jets are operating off of Japanese flat tops by none other than the US Marine pilots to test operational feasibility in the meantime. Outside of operations testing, Japan does 2 more things with its aircraft-less carriers: participate in lots of photo exercises and take people on joyrides. That's right, the Japanese frequently use carriers' elevators to entertain foreign leaders as they take them on rides up and down. In fact, frequently, the rides are even open to the public, who absolutely love them. Speaking of elevators, the Izumo-class has 2 elevators, one at the fore middle and one aft right. The deckside elevators are more susceptible to the effects of waves on small ships and are an obstacle when mooring alongside a quay. But the advantage is that they can transport large aircraft, ones that are larger than the elevator itself. We should note that Izumo carriers are handicapped by not having ski jumps or catapults. A ski jump, just like the ones on the Royal Navy's Queen Elizabeth-class aircraft carriers, allows aircraft to take off with more weight, which translates to more fuel and weapons. The design of both ships allows for the addition of the ski jump, but there are no immediate plans to do that. You might be wondering how the Japanese carriers compare to the ones around the world. The Izumo-class carry up to 28 aircraft and weighs 26,000 tons at full displacement. Meanwhile, the Italian light aircraft carrier Cavour weighs 30,000 tons and can carry up to 30 aircraft. The Spanish Navy's light carrier Juan Carlos weighs 26,000 tons and can carry up to 25 aircraft. Compared to the American supercarriers that can carry up to 90 aircraft, Izumo is quarter of their size, and roughly 60% of the size of the America-class amphibious assault ships that can carry in excess of 22 aircraft. For now, JS Kaga is actually larger than Izumo, given that it weighs 27,000 tons, because its flight deck was converted to the rectangular shape. But why is the rectangular shape needed? In their original configuration, the Izumo-class helicopter destroyers were not suitable for operation of the F-35Bs. To solve this issue, a two-stage conversion process was established. During the first stage, the flight deck was strengthened against the heat generated by the F-35B's exhaust. Additionally, a yellow centerline on the deck was also added for F-35B's landing and takeoffs. Finally, the necessary power supply equipment had to be installed. While those modifications were sufficient to operate F-35Bs, the carrier flight deck operations remained far from ideal. In October 2021, American Marine Corps F-35Bs successfully conducted landings and takeoffs from the Izumo destroyer. But they found a problem. Izumo's bow is trapezoid-shaped, meaning that the F-35B's lift was not evenly distributed as the aircraft was taking off. For this reason, the yellow bow line had to be moved further inward, which reduced the maximum takeoff distance. As a result, during the first stage conversion to accommodate F-35Bs, the bow of JS Kaga was converted from a trapezoid shape to a rectangular shape, similar to the Wasp and America-class amphibious assault ships. With a rectangular-shaped deck, the bow line could be moved closer to the bow, which provided more space for takeoffs. This bow modification would be similarly applied to the Izumo destroyer during its second stage retrofits, which would happen by 2028. The second stage conversion would also include internal modifications inside Izumo's and Kaga's hangar bays to accommodate the F-35s. But how did the JMSDF trick politicians into buying an aircraft carrier? Just like the color of this dress can be debated, so can the interpretation of the Japanese Constitution. Within the old interpretation of the Constitution, there was no necessity for Japan to have aircraft carriers, because under any defensive scenario, they would operate in proximity to Japanese islands. And this made carriers no more valuable than having air bases on land. The old interpretation of Article 9 is that JSDF can only be used for domestic security purposes. This interpretation prohibited Japan from invading other countries or settling international disputes using force. But the old interpretation changed in 2015 when Prime Minister Shinzo Abe convinced the Supreme Court to include the right to collective self-defense. This means that if Japan's allies are engaged in a defensive war, it's in Japan's national security interest to assist allies with their defensive war by sending JMSDF forces on overseas deployments. And this is how an aircraft carrier went from being an offensive weapon to a defensive one. As a result, on December 18, 2018, just 1 year after commissioning JS Kaga, the Japanese government approved to modify the two ships into de facto aircraft carriers. The criticism was hard, and not just from China. For example, the Japanese media perceived the new carriers as a step toward militarism. At least during one news conference with the defense minister, half of the questions dealt with whether Izumo was an aircraft carrier or not. Nevertheless, the Japanese government still designated the ships as DDH, or helicopter-carrying destroyers. The Izumo-class ships are also sometimes tagged as multi-role destroyers. But Japan still refuses to call them for what they really are: aircraft carriers. But why does Japan need aircraft carriers to begin with? Besides helping their allies, the aircraft carriers are needed to protect Japan's navy. The Japanese government views Izumo being equipped with F-35Bs still as a tool for self-defense. They argue that in the age of modern cruise missiles, it is necessary to have fighter jets such as F-35s, because the average range of ship-killing missiles is in hundreds of miles, while the average range of defensive ship-launched anti-air missiles is only about 100 miles. So having aircraft such as F-35Bs is essential to defending the self-defense fleet, because the aircraft will be able to detect and destroy attacking ships before they can even launch their weapons. I should add that the JMSDF's decision to have carriers was not done in a vacuum. This is in response to China's military buildup as well as North Korea's. The new interpretation of the Japanese constitution allows the defense forces to modernize and grow in order to ensure their national survival. So yes, the Izumo-class aircraft carriers, let's call them for what they are, combined with F-35Bs will allow Japan to conduct offensive operations for a defensive sea-control strategy. The best defense is a good offense. Surprisingly, the United States actually supports this Japanese initiative because they see a close ally stepping up to invest into their defense beyond just the bare minimum. As a result, over the past decade, the JMSDF has been modernizing its fleet and launching multiple new ships each year, which brings us to Japan's ship launch ceremonies. In the West, the ships are christened by slamming a champagne bottle against the ship's hull. But this is risky, because if the bottle fails to break, it's a curse to a horrible shipwreck. Yes, Japan is also superstitious, but they mitigate this risk by using a silver axe. For each ship, a silver axe is made that is thought to bring good luck and scare away evil spirits. The axe is used to cut the rope that holds the ship in place. The rope is connected to a giant paper sphere and a champagne bottle, which is slammed against the hull. As the rope is cut, the curtain covering the ship's name is removed. The paper sphere is broken, and a large amount of paper tape, confetti, and balloons fly out of the sphere and its surroundings. The paper sphere is meant to bless the birth of a new ship and its future prosperity. And that's the Japanese ship launch ceremony, where popping the sphere blesses the ship with good luck and pollutes the ocean with self-defense microplastics.